So today is Tuesday, November the 13th, 2012, and we're continuing in our faith, social justice, and public life discussion. I'm Jacob Loop, the teaching assistant for the course. Reverend Jim Wallis is overseas at the moment, doing some work with a global consortium of leaders from all different fields on bringing diverse perspectives together to tackle problems and work toward the common good. So today we are continuing in our study of ecology, environmental issues, climate change, and we have with us a staffer from Jim's organization, Sojourners, Alycia Ashburn. So Alicia will give herself, I think, a little bit of an introduction to let us know about her personal and vocational history, and then we'll launch into a presentation on the climate change work she's doing at Sojourners, and we'll follow the usual format in terms of discussion. So please welcome Alycia Ashburn from Sojourners.
Hi, everyone. I know I met some of you last week. Thanks for having me back again this week. It's really fun to be with such a sharp group of students. My name is Alicia, and I grew up in western Minnesota in a town of around 400 people in southwestern Minnesota. I'm a farm girl. And I went to a small college in Iowa called Luther College, and I did graduate work in the sciences at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So if you want to talk ecology or bugs later, I'd be happy to do so. And but I've spent most of the last 10 years or so doing a lot of nonprofit work because I really felt called to help others who are people of faith inspire action to address global warming mostly. But I've worked on a number of other environmental issues as well. So that brought me to Sojourners in February of this year, and I am their Creation Care campaign director. So last week when we met, a lot of you had gone to the polls or mailed in your ballots. Some of you were felt that was sort of anticlimactic. I think Jim and I each stood in line for a couple hours to vote, but as he was saying, based on his experience in South Africa, that was still seemingly very much a privilege, and it was for me too. And we talked about how ironic it was that both last week and this week we are scheduled to talk about climate change, given that the topics for this semester are arranged mostly by when guest speakers can come. And so it just happened that climate change happened to coincide with the election and right after Hurricane Sandy. And this was the topic that was not discussed in the election. And as Jim said, our oil addiction has put our grandchildren and our very souls in jeopardy. So here we are today. We've just experienced two of the most expensive events in U.S. history. The presidential campaign, they think, may have cost over $2.5 billion. The destruction wreaked by Sandy may reach up to $50 billion. And meanwhile, they call them the big five oil companies, BP, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, and Royal Dutch Shell are on track to easily exceed $100 billion in profits this year. Statistic from 2010, ExxonMobil made $30.5 billion in profits. They paid 18% in federal income tax, but they paid none in 2009. Chevron made $19 billion in 2010 and paid under 8% in federal income taxes. They also did not pay any income taxes in 2009. And last I heard, and you guys might correct me on this later, you probably are more in touch with these numbers than I am, the U.S. government pays about $10 billion a year to fossil fuel companies in the form of subsidies. 33% of our carbon dioxide emissions in the U.S. Go to the transportation sector, and 60% of those are domestic oil consumption. Now, we did hear President Obama talk very briefly about climate change in his victory speech. And he said, "We want our children to live in an America that isn't burdened by debt, that isn't wreaked by inequality, that isn't weakened by inequality, that isn't threatened by the destructive power of a warming planet." I know some of you are from New York or New Jersey, or and you talked a little bit about it, your family members and friends there last week. Threatened by the destructive power of a warming planet. Threatened. I think the families who lost their homes and their loved ones in New York and New Jersey feel more than threatened. I'm guessing they feel devastated. So I'm going to start by going a little bit more into the science. And I know it's depressing. I know you read about some of it in Bill Mckibben's article. But as one of my mentors, a Lutheran theologian, said, we cannot imagine the size of the solution until we understand the scale and the scope of the problem. And it's also helpful, I think, for us to all get on the same plane with respect to some of the science. Let's talk about degrees, not graduate degrees. We've already warmed the Earth about 1 degree Celsius since the Industrial Revolution. And we're now on pace and to reach anywhere from 1 to 5 degrees Celsius more in coming decades. In the Mckibben article that you read from Rolling Stones in August, there's a race and a goal to keep it at no more than 2 degrees Celsius. To give you some perspective, during the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, the global average temperature was 5 degrees Celsius colder than it is today. So we had some of the glaciers here were 2 miles thick, covering parts of North America. So 5 degrees Celsius colder during the ice age. And we may warm. There was a new science article released on Friday that said climate change may be more severe than we originally predicted. The newer models are showing that it could be as much as 6 degrees Celsius in the coming decades. I know degrees Celsius are a little bit hard for us in the US and the UK to think in terms of. That's why I wanted to give you the perspective of the last ice age. Now, when I was doing work in Minnesota, some nonprofit work, there was a state senator from a suburb of Minneapolis who had been a pastor. He had some level of science training at some point. And when I met with him, he said that he really had a hard time wrapping his head around the fact that human beings collectively could raise the temperature of the entire Earth, our entire atmosphere, 1 whole degree. He just had a hard time believing that. And when I thought about it like that, I thought, that is kind of pretty impressive, right? I mean, we have, in civilizations past, destroyed parts of the Earth. Some of you have probably read Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, where he talks about how, the Romans and the Mayans, ever since we abandoned hunter-gatherer and went to more of an agricultural-based civilization, we have had a history, humans have, of exploiting our natural resources. And then we move on to another patch that we can exploit, and then we move on again. So we've done this before at a smaller scale, but now we've gotten to the point where we've altered the lungs of our entire planet. I don't know if any of you have visited Mayan ruins. Yeah, some of you. I visited a handful. Chichen Itza in Mexico, Tikal in Guatemala, Caracol in Belize. And there's one in the Yucatan Peninsula south of Chichen Itza that's a little bit more obscure. I think it's near Tulum. And the ruins are not very uncovered. In fact, if you look out over them, it just looks like jungle. And I think that's fascinating. Alan Weissman wrote a book called The World Without Us. And in the first chapter, I haven't read the whole thing yet, but from what I understand of the summary, in the first chapter, all the humans basically die. We've killed ourselves off. And the rest of the book is about how the Earth heals itself. And it's stuff like that, The oceans will come back to their normal pH. The coral reefs would grow back. The jungles would once again cover what was once the basis of civilization and architecture. So the Earth doesn't need us. I could bore you with graphs. I purposely did not bring a PowerPoint today. The greenhouse gases, and just a quick reminder, a greenhouse gas, we need greenhouse gases to survive. Just like, is it Senator Inhofe said, plants breathe carbon dioxide, we breathe oxygen. It's true, we would not have life on this planet without the greenhouse effect, which traps heat from the sun so that we have enough warmth in our atmosphere. That's what makes Earth unique. And these gases like carbon dioxide, methane, ozone at a certain level are very, very good at trapping heat. Some are better than others. The gases collectively that we have today, the level of them hasn't not been seen in the last 650,000 years, maybe longer. Now that's just that's quantity. If you think about a long red line and it spikes on the graph, it spikes at the very end. Sorry, you're looking at it from this way. We're way up here. And that's enough to really scare some people. 200 years ago, start of the Industrial Revolution, our carbon dioxide concentrations were 275 parts per million. Today we're at almost 400 parts per million. And the last time they were that high was 15 to 20 million years ago, according to some sources. Now we know some of this from ice cores, and I could get into details about that later if you want. Another perspective in terms of quantity, parts per million, we are on track, the rate we're emitting greenhouse gases today, to be anywhere from 800 to 1,000 parts per million in the coming decades. But the quantity is not actually what disturbs me the most and disturbs a lot of scientists. It's the rate. So I mentioned before, 12,000 years ago, we were 5 degrees centigrade, 5 degrees Celsius colder than we are today. So what is that? We've warmed about 1 degree every 2,000 years since the last ice age. And then we warmed another degree since the Industrial Revolution. That's a very different pace. That's 10 times, sometimes 20 times as fast as in the past. The director of the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota, he used to be at the University of Wisconsin, which is where I met him, Dr. Jonathan Foley, when asked if climate change is what keeps him lying awake at night, said, it's not that it's just climate change, it's that it's climate change and everything else. It's deforestation, it's invasive species, it's overpopulation, it's air and water pollution, it's habitat fragmentation. Just a really simple example of habitat fragmentation and climate change. Do we have any Wisconsinites here? The Baraboo Hills are these beautiful, beautiful area of central Wisconsin, and there's hemlock, stands of hemlock trees there, and they grow only in those hills at a certain altitude, and they can't migrate. Now, obviously they can't walk, but they can't also, their seeds won't be viable outside of where they're already at because there's nowhere for them to land with all the development that has occurred around the hills. And there's nowhere further up in altitude for them to go because of climate change. So as the hills get warmer and warmer, there's nowhere for them to go. That's just one example of how hard it is for plants and animals to adapt at a certain pace to keep up with the pace that we're influencing our environment. One of you said last week, you'd read somewhere that global warming, somebody had said global warming is good for commerce because it will open up shipping routes in the Arctic. And I thought that was, I'm not surprised to hear that. It's disturbing, and here's why. Climate change is so complex. We often have a very skewed, one-sided understanding of something. Loss of Arctic sea ice opening up shipping routes in the Arctic. When we lose sea ice, which is white, we lose that surface area that was once white, was reflecting light, and therefore heat back into the atmosphere and back into space. So when that's now dark and due to the sea, we're absorbing more of that heat and infrared radiation, and that accelerates climate change. As the air warms, it holds more moisture, and we have more frequent and severe precipitation events. We're not just losing the sea ice, our permafrost is melting. and the permafrost holds methane. And methane as a gas is, I think, 17 times better at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. Again, enhancing climate change. Shipping in the Arctic, I'm guessing that we're not just moving goods, we're probably also talking about moving oil. More drilling, more extraction of fossil fuels means more global warming. And just the kinetic energy, the presence of those ships in those in the Arctic Ocean will increase the temperature of the Arctic Ocean itself. Fossil fuels. Another mentor, Dr. Cal DeWitt, Professor Emeritus at University of Wisconsin-Madison, he wrote an article for us in Sojourners like a few months ago in the magazine. He says fossil fuels, that term is a misnomer. They should be called fossil carbons because they should reflect how long it took them to reach that form as oil, coal, or natural gas. Have any of you heard of the term peat? Not the guy, but the peat. Peat is basically, some people use it to enhance their garden or something. It contains a lot of nutrients. It's rich in nutrients, and that's basically because it's decomposing plants, usually wetland plants. When plants die over thousands, if not millions of years, and with pressure and layers of more dying plants, the carbon that's in their tissues is compressed. And it compresses more and more and more. And peat is the precursor to coal. And coal, in some circumstances, is actually the precursor to diamonds. So plants, via photosynthesis, take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, turn it into lovely green leaves, stalks, flowers, things we can eat. And then they die, some of them die, and they accumulate over thousands of years, and it leads to the formation of fossil carbons like coal. The natural gas in Pennsylvania, that's from ancient seabeds. They're called fossil for a reason. And we're rapidly converting what took thousands of years to accumulate and releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. We're speeding up the entire process at a rate the Earth has never, ever experienced before. And to that effect, some geologists and evolutionary biologists have wondered if we shouldn't call this era the Anthropocene. We have the Holocene and the Paleocene, and some have proposed the term Anthropocene. A banking analogy for you with respect to fossil fuels. Let's say that fossil fuels, or fossil carbons, if we're using Cal DeWitt's term, is our savings account. It took a long, long time to accumulate, to store up that money, and we only want to use it in an emergency. So what's the readily available money in our checking account? Renewable energy, sun, wind, you name it. The U.S., we'll get into solar a little bit later. The U.S. is 5% of the world's population, and we emit 25% of the world's carbon dioxide. If that is not an injustice issue, I don't know what is. Those who feel the effects and the burdens of climate change, the consequences, are those who are most vulnerable and least able to do anything about it. If everyone in the world lived like we live in the U.S., we would need 5 planets to produce what we consume and absorb and how we absorb our waste. If you live in the UK, if everybody lived like they do in the UK, we'd need 3 planets. If everybody in the world lived like they do in South Africa, we'd need 1 planet. So it's 1 for 1. And in India, 0.4. The average North American generates about 20 tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year, and the world average is just under 4 tons. In 1 week, U.S. consumers buy more than 500 million gallons of bottled water. I cleaned some of these up from a trash trap in the Anacostia River the other day, by the way. They said plastic bottles are by far the most common thing they see in these trash traps. 20,000 pounds of waste they clean from those trash traps in the Anacostia every year. No, 20,000 pounds is what we produce, and 10,000 is what they've been able to capture per year in the last couple of years. So we buy more than 500 million gallons of bottled water, and in 1 week, it's enough bottles of water to circle the globe 5 times in 1 week. we would save 17 million barrels of oil that's used in manufacturing the bottles. And that would be enough oil for 100,000 cars to run for a year. So 1 year, enough oil for 100,000 cars if we got rid of bottled water for 1 week. There's enough solar energy that falls on the earth, on the surface of the earth, every 40 minutes to meet 100% of the world's energy needs for an entire year. An entire year, there's enough solar energy that falls on the earth in 40 minutes to meet our energy needs for a year. Enough wind power blows through the Midwest corridor every day to meet 100% of the US electricity demand. This is not a technology issue, it's not an economic issue, it's a political will issue, it's a cultural issue. And it isn't an issue. I've been making this argument to colleagues in every social justice and environmental justice sector. That's my pet peeve, is calling climate and compartmentalizing it into just one more issue. To me, it is every single issue. If we don't address this now, we should have addressed it 10 years ago, then all the progress we've made on every other social justice issue, I think, personally, is for naught. I asked some of our fabulous assistants at Sojourners to put together a little chart. I just wanted to see what it would look like. So do me a favor, at the top, list climate change and ... And in the first column, write every issue you can think of that is tied to climate change. And then in the second column, put the corresponding examples of the effects. And then third column, put links to what press you've seen and scholarly stuff you've seen, people who might be working on it. But just in one brainstorming session, a couple of them came up with 19 or 20 issues. So poverty in the developing world, poverty in the developed world, infrastructure, food prices, immigration, war and peace, biodiversity, tourism in economies, industry, water access, agriculture, housing, public health, unemployment, AIDS, human trafficking, budget deficits, energy production, inequality. That's a lot. A few examples. Well, just the other day we saw in the news that allergies from pollen are projected to intensify with climate change, so there's health. We've heard that before. We've just learned in September that more cases of asthma and allergies will be coming with longer seasons. They'll be more extreme. This leads to decreased productivity at work and school, making it an education and an economic problem. I won't even go into malaria, but I can provide some information on that if you'd like. I have some friends and colleagues who are studying that, in the increased rate of malaria and the increased geographic coverage of where these mosquitoes can live and transmit the malaria. National security, this was a new headline just this weekend. Again, I think in the New York Times, new report highlights link between climate change and national security. Immigration. Have you guys done immigration yet this semester? According to the International Federation of the Red Cross, climate change already causes more population displacement than war and persecution combined. If global climate change continues, anywhere from 50 to 330 million people could be displaced by 2080. The number of people across the world severely affected by flooding each year is projected to increase from less than 5 million now to somewhere between 160 to 370 million by 2100. That's from the Global Humanitarian Forum. And the amount of money that our government, other governments from developed nations, and all of our faith-based international relief and development organizations spend to help with refugee resettlement will have to increase. Some project 5 to 10-fold to meet the needs of how climate change affects migration. Hunger and malnutrition. This is poverty. The number of people affected by malnutrition could rise to 600 million by 2080. An additional 1.8 billion could be living in a water-scarce environment by 2080. Up to 330 million people could be permanently or temporarily displaced through flooding, and an additional 220 to 400 million people could be exposed to malaria. That's from a United Nations Development Program report just in 2007. It hasn't even been updated. So let's connect the dots. And this is part of what Bill Mckibben does, and it's brilliant. For those that don't get it, for those, and I think to some degree, this is due to just how we've structured our understanding of things academically over the years. We've compartmentalized them. We've broken them down into categories to put them in understandable units. But we've compartmentalized them to the extent that we are now having to reconnect the dots to see how these things are so inextricably linked. Climate change isn't an issue, it's every issue. Okay, I'm done with the depressing statistics for a little bit. Do I have hope? Do I think there's strategy? Yes. Is climate change big? Yes. Guess what? My God is bigger. I bet your God is too. Bill Mckibben just said on his new Do the Math tour, climate change is the single biggest thing that humans have ever done on this planet. The one thing that needs to be bigger is our movement to stop. By the way, his Rolling Stone article, did you go online and see this at all? Did you see how many likes and shares and comments? It's pretty spectacular. 122,000 likes, 90,000 shares, 13,000 tweets, and over 5,000 comments. And most of those, I'm guessing the 90,000 shares, I actually heard that number back in September or October. That's a lot. So are people hungry for this information? Yes. Is it complicated? Yes. Then let's uncomplicate it. Is it vague and intangible? Well, it's no longer vague and intangible for people in New York, New Jersey, Haiti, and all of the developing world. How do we break it down into meaningful components, not untie them from the important other issues, but break it down into meaningful components that we can understand and address? We've tackled big things like this before. John F. Kennedy said, let's put a man on the moon in 10 years. They did it in less than 9 years. During World War II, right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, FDR said, we're going to set an ambitious goal. We're going to produce 60,000 planes. No one thought this was possible. But they banned the production and the sale of cars, and the industry focused solely on airplane engines. And between 1942 and 1944, the U.S. built 229,600 planes. It's a lot more than 60,000. And they added 5,000 ships to the 1,000 that they already had in 1939. So when we need to and want to have the political, economic, and cultural motivation to change, we can do it. Lester Brown in Plan B 3.0, and I think this is an author, environmental author, who I think is now up to 4.0, Plan B 4.0 or 5.0 even. In his 3.0, he said, this mobilization of resources within a matter of months demonstrates that a country, and indeed the world, can restructure the economy quickly if convinced of the need to do so. Has anybody read any Paul Hawken? He's an environmental economist. He wrote a book called Blessed Unrest. I think Jim has my copy at the moment. It's dense. It's very thick, but if anybody can get through it, you guys can. At the very beginning, the very premise of the book, after going all over the world and giving hundreds of thousands of talks over the years, he's probably in his 60s now, he had accumulated all these business cards. And one day he found as many of these business cards back as he possibly could and threw them all out on his living room floor or something, all one place. I mean, thousands upon thousands of business cards. And he just, reflected over them. And he came to the realization that this was the start this is the start of a movement that really is more than a movement. It's bigger than the civil rights movement. It's bigger than any movement we've seen in the past. In fact, it's a combination of all the above, and it's sort of amorphous. It's all over the world. But if you combine all the little things happening all over the world, and I'll give you a list in just a little bit of all the faith-based environmental organizations, not all of them, but I'll list some of them off for you. He was really, really encouraged by that. He thinks that we have a network of many movements that will combine, and we're talking poverty, we're talking immigration, we're talking climate change, we're talking water, we're talking everything, that will combine to make one major movement. His whole book, Blessed Unrest, is about hope based on that premise. You read some of the faith-based statements. I can send you a 130-page document of a summary of all the faith-based statements that are out there addressing climate change, if you'd like. Somebody put this together recently. But just for starters, this should inspire you. Here's a list. It's funny because I give you statistics and name off all these press releases and things, titles that are depressing, but this list should inspire you. So, groups working on climate change from a faith perspective. National Religious Partnership for the Environment. That is the Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life, plus the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, plus the National Council of Churches, which represents, I believe, 70 different mainline Protestant denominations, and the Evangelical Environmental Network. Restoring Eden, Earth Ministry, Interfaith Power and Light, which I've worked for, the Asabel Institute, the Forum on Religion and Ecology, every single mainline denomination you can think of. United Methodist Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Presbyterian Church USA, every mainline denomination, the Unitarian Universalists, the Roman Catholic Church. We have the Catholic Coalition on Climate Change, the Reformed Church in America, the Christian Reformed Church. We have the Friends Committee on Unity with Nature. We have the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. We have the Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. We have Blessed Earth. We have Micah Challenge. We have Plant with Purpose, Erosha, Christians for the Mountains, the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good, and I could go on and on all afternoon. That's pretty inspiring, right? Mckibben's Do the Math tour. He will be on the road almost this entire month. And I believe he'll be in D.C. on Saturday, November 17th. The venue may have already sold out, as it has for most of his talks already, and they're looking at 1,000 people per venue. So I'm guessing they'll be adding more venues and more tour places in the future. Did any of you read the piece on Richard Cizik, an evangelical? Did I include that? Yeah. He used to be the vice president for the National Association of Evangelicals, and when he met with my mentor, Cal DeWitt, and Sir John Houghton, a climate scientist and evangelical Christian from England, back at Oxford at a forum we were at in 2002, he had a conversion moment. You've heard Jim talk about conversion moments before. He went from being a complete climate change skeptic, almost a denier, to believing wholeheartedly that it is our duty to care for the bountiful resources God has provided for us, and that we are doing undue damage to the earth through climate change. And has his new organization, the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good. Tri Robinson is a pastor in Boise, Idaho. Right? This is not Madison, Wisconsin. Vineyard Church. He wanted to do a sermon on creation care. This is some years ago now. Was kind of nervous about doing it in that place. Didn't really know where his parishioners were at on this, but his daughter was being, I think, baptized, and so he went ahead with it. Had a great creation care water sermon, and received a standing ovation afterward. Joel Hunter at Northland Church in Orlando, Florida. More and more churches, faith leaders are feeling like they have the coverage and the permission of the people that they work with to address this, name this issue. Katharine Hayhoe is an evangelical climate scientist. She and her husband, who's a pastor, Pastor Andrew Farley, wrote this book, A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions. Rush Limbaugh took a big stab at her last year, I think around January. And so Sojourners started an action alert, a campaign, support Katharine Hayhoe. And let me pull out the numbers. Over 4,100 people took this action alert supporting Katharine Hayhoe, and we sent all the names to her. When Obama rejected at least one version of the Keystone XL pipeline last January, Sojourners said, "Let's thank Obama," and more than 10,000 people signed a letter to that effect. When Keystone was up in the Senate, again, we went to Sojourners members and said, let's ask the Senate to reject the Keystone Pipeline, and more than 5,500 emails went out. When the EPA was hearing rules for new power plants, new regulations for new power plants going up this past May, Sojourners members provided over 3,300 comments to the EPA, and I testified, and all of those things you can find on our blog if you want to. But that's a lot of people, and that should give us hope. Katharine Hayhoe also, in her relationship with another professor at Texas Tech University, was talking with him. He was from an very oil-heavy part of Texas, and he was not in any way interested in climate change, thought it was a hoax. But she talked with him about God and creation, and he eventually came to see the light, and now they tag team and do tours in Texas. And here's the thing, you have to tailor your message to the audience. He says that even Boone Pickens, the oil baron, does not deny climate change. But when he talks about it, he doesn't talk about climate change. He doesn't name climate change. He talks about national security, and he talks about technology and investment options. This person, Dr. Green, is a chemist and a specialist in all things physics and engineering. And I met with him a couple weeks ago. He's great. He's really funny. He really helps keep people grounded, if you ask me. I drive a Prius, and he told me people in his congregation in Texas call that a Pius, and it emits smog because pro-environmental behaviors are seen as self-righteous in certain parts of the U.S. And I'm sure some of you come from parts of the U.S. that you can understand that, and you've experienced that yourself. I think that's really funny and interesting. He too talks about national security and energy efficiency. He thinks wind might be the next best thing if we make it competitive with fossil fuels. He said, and you should Google this, that there are new batteries that are liquid metal batteries that can basically store wind energy. So we can make this part of the grid for cities across the United States. He sent me some slides from a talk he did, and there's a guy throwing up glitter, and it's this man who has made photovoltaic cells that's the size of glitter. I've heard there are people who are making photovoltaic paint. So it's not that we don't have the technology to do this. It's like Jim has said with every other issue, we need the political and the cultural willpower to do it. Even China and India are investing heavily in renewables because they want to be leaders, and they know that there's money to be made there. John Foley, who I mentioned earlier, who said he loses sleep at night because of the complex array of issues, says, when somebody asks, is there a silver bullet for addressing climate change, he says, there's no silver bullet, but there is buckshot. Do we have any hunters in here? I love that analogy. We have to be the best storytellers that we can be. Sometimes we have to immerse ourselves, and we have to help others be immersed. we're leading these pollution and poverty environmental justice tours, Sojourners. This is part of our campaign because we really think that Christians who hold the same values, who you can't talk to about climate change necessarily because it's seen as a political issue, not a theological or a science one. They come from very, very different backgrounds, but if you put them in touch with each other, you introduce them to each other, people who grew up in some of the most polluted neighborhoods and people who grew up in the most affluent communities. We're sending people down the river on a boat to clean up trash and meet folks who've been living in poverty. How's that for an immersion tour? You can come on one next spring. We have to connect the dots. We have to tailor our messages to our audience. And we have to practice democracy. And I think that despite all the corporate funding that went to this last election, the way that the election turned out was pretty interesting and should be, in some ways, inspiring for how we move forward as a democracy. And I heard Bono was here on campus last night. Did anybody go see him? Hear him? Yeah. He said, when the story of these times gets written, we wanted to say that we did all we could, and it was more than anyone could have imagined. And I think that's a great call to action. Questions?
Hi, I have a question over here.
Hi.
Thank you very much for coming to speak with us today. You had mentioned something with regard to a specific type of, my name is Joseph, by the way.
Thank you.
Something with regard to a specific type of cell that could even be infused with paint that is something that is an alternate source of energy. And I just wanted, if you know anything about that, just a little bit of explanation of what that is.
I wish I knew more. I can look it up for you. Does anybody here know more? That actually, I heard about the paint. I heard about a while ago. So.
Is it solar energy?
Yeah, it's solar. It's photovoltaic.
Via paint?
Yeah. Paint.
Interesting.
So instead of putting black shingles on our roof, we could paint our roofs with photovoltaic paint and have solar power for our homes. Isn't that crazy? Keep in mind that black shingles absorb heat, so, you know, in some areas of the U.S., it's just really not a very smart thing to do.
Thank you for coming as well. My name is Jonah. I'm curious what you think of the most recent efforts by Senator Kerry, Graham, and Lieberman in the last Congress to address climate change, as well as future policies, whether cap and trade or cap and dividend, which is another approach, how salient those approaches may be.
Yeah. The word on the street, and this was pre-election, from some of my colleagues in the environmental organizations, is that since that comprehensive climate change legislation failed in 2010, that we may not see comprehensive legislation like that again for possibly another 10 years. That's depressing. The carbon tax that was introduced over the weekend, I'm not sure how realistic it is. I've been trying to get a pulse on that from some of my friends. I think it's good we're talking about it. These are the kind of the discussions we should have been having a long time ago. And I think Mayor Bloomberg and Governor Cuomo have kind of helped push that along after Sandy. But that, whether or not it's practical, those of us in the faith community need to be really, really careful that it doesn't, that the poorest of the poor don't bear the burden the most for something like that. And that doesn't mean it's not possible and that we couldn't find ways to protect them, but I think the devil might be in the details there. Yeah, I think we can see other pieces of legislation. The administration has a pretty long list of things that they have done over the years with respect to fuel efficiency in vehicles and strengthening the Environmental Protection Agency. But you can't talk about Environmental Protection Agency or in any sort of regulation like that with certain sectors of the American people. And that's okay. There are other ways to talk about it with them, including faith. I don't get discouraged by that. Sorry if I didn't completely address your question.
So your little anecdote about the Prius, I can totally relate to that because I'm the same. I drive a Prius where I'm from in central Illinois, and everyone thinks it's like the most ridiculous thing ever. But I guess my question is, the people that make fun of me about that, as much as I would like to drop all these like scientific stats on them, that's not something that they're really going to listen to. So how, with kind of just the average American red-blooded, how do you like approach this topic and start to try to convince them that this is an issue worth worrying about?
My dad, I talk about hunting. He gets it. He sees it. The hunting season's longer. What he hunts and where he hunts it has changed. In Minnesota, well, let me give you an example. In Minnesota, if you don't mind me going for a little bit. Well, first of all, a number of very, very important groups of people from very different parts of Minnesota came together for both comprehensive renewable energy legislation, but before that, mercury legislation. And here's what was beautiful about it. The mercury legislation brought together what we call the hook and bullet crowd. So the fishermen and the hunters with the tourism industries, so like the North Shore, Minnesota, and the lakes area, agriculture, business, all the environmental groups, all the water groups, the health groups, public health. We had a pregnant pediatrician giving testimony, and I think we could see that again. You saw the maps from the different ways of picturing how our vote turned out last week, right? Did you see the one with the shades of purple? Yeah, it's kind of cool. I think there's ways for various groups to come together again on that, and there's entries and doorways talking about it with certain groups of people, regardless of what we think, and sometimes are depressed. When I was in Minnesota, there's a polar explorer by the name of Will Steger. There are a lot of polar explorers, but he's received a number of awards from National Geographic, and a lot of them live in Minnesota for some reason, go figure. He, after his decades of trips to the Antarctic and the Arctic, he said several years ago, he said, I am dedicating the rest of my life to global warming education. And most explorers will charge a fee if you want them to talk and give slideshow of their beautiful trips and the polar bears and the dogs from the dog sleds, and fabulous, because they need to make money for the next expedition, right? But he said, I'll talk to church groups and schools for free. So a number of us, both secular and faith-based nonprofits, said, great, we'll partner with you and help you. So we held global warming forums called Eyewitness to Global Warming when I was there, over 17 different houses of worship. We did them specifically in synagogues, in Catholic churches, and Lutheran churches, Presbyterian, you name it. And we told people why we were doing it there, because every faith tradition has something to say about caring for the Creator, the Creator's good gifts, whoever your Creator may be. And Will would lead with his fabulous slideshow. And then somebody from another nonprofit would talk about economic and policy opportunities. People were pretty depressed by the time he got done showing us pictures of how much the Arctic and the Antarctic had changed over the years. And then the person of faith, and we tried to match our leaders with whatever house of worship we were in. So we had a Jewish person go give a little talk and rally the folks if we were in a synagogue, and maybe a deacon if we were in a Catholic church. And we had them, if they were interested, form creation care teams. And almost every house of worship that we did one in, they formed a creation care team if they didn't already have one. Now, that was a term we used in Minnesota that worked well. In other states, they just use the word green teams. And I could go into another afternoon session about these green teams. They're pretty fabulous. But the point is, we also collected, these forums were way more successful than we could have ever imagined. By the end, we were having them in really large suburban metro churches because there were up to 1,000 people coming for one forum, and so we were trying to meet the space requirements. Second, we had people sign postcards, depending on what year it was, what legislation was up, and what leader. And one of them, for example, was, at the time, was to Senator Norm Coleman, former senator of Minnesota, to ask for his leadership. He was on a strategic committee on climate change, and it just said, Dear Senator Coleman, as a person of faith, I believe that it is long past time to address climate change, blah, blah. And so we then took, these thousands and thousands of postcards and hand-delivered them to sometimes state senators and reps. Now, that, in addition to the hard work that a lot of environmental groups and other groups have been doing all along, led to the passage of one of the strongest renewable energy pieces of legislation for a state in the U.S. I believe it was passed in 2007. That's a story of hope. And more states have done it since then. Now, it's been challenged since then as well. So sorry, that's kind of a long answer to your question. But I had family members who I never expected to see in that kind of a forum who were there. And I don't know what did it for some of them. For some it was the faith, for some of them it was the science, for some of it was merely seeing the slides they were showing. By the way, you can see a similar beautiful new movie with photography from the Arctic and the Antarctic. It's called Chasing Ice. I'll try and remember. I'll send you the link to free tickets because the PR firm has gotten in touch with us and offered us free passes. But it's spectacular photography.
Hi, my name's Dionysios, or Dio for short. I have a short and a medium question. You said someone named Mckibben was, sorry, what was their name exactly?
Bill Mckibben?
Mckibben. And he's going to give a talk here, but it might be sold out or something.
Bill Mckibben wrote. Well, he's a Methodist Sunday school teacher from Vermont who is a scholar in residence at Middlebury College there, and he's a longtime environmental author and activist, and he was one of the main ones to help spearhead some of this anti-Keystone Pipeline legislation. He and one of the editors from Sojourners magazine got arrested together in front of the White House last year. They go back a long way. His organization, 350.org, which has a very young demographic and following, has kicked off, and this is partly due to the success of this Rolling Stones article that we've talked about, with over 90,000 shares. They launched this tour called Do the Math, and it has to do with the 2 degrees Celsius that we're trying to keep. We'll keep our carbon dioxide levels at a certain, so that we don't go over 2 degrees Celsius warming. And he uses some other figures. But yeah, super, super popular. A lot of the venues have sold out. I don't know that they've sold out for DC, but I'll send the information along to you guys through Jacob.
Okay. And I have another little question. So we as students, what, in all your work in environmental things, what organizations could you recommend we get involved with to either show our support or maybe give our time for these various things to be most efficient or that are, I don't know.
Any and all.
Any and all.
It will take all of you. It will take all of us. I will send you a list. I read some of them during my talk, and some of my lists are outdated, so I had an assistant work on it yesterday. But we still need to alphabetize it or categorize it according to what faith tradition or whatnot. But tons and tons and tons of organizations, and I'll send you links to all of those. And I would just look at some of the websites and figure out which one suits you best. Some are more some work more with kind of behind the scenes with more conservative groups. Some of them are very much on the practical side of reducing carbon dioxide, working on our footprint. So it really varies. Oh boy.
Alicia, can I ask you real quick to address, you mentioned in passing in 2002 when Richard Cizik had his conversion moment on climate change. Could you say more about what that cost him in terms of standing with his constituents? Because I think it's important for people to know.
Yeah, shortly after Richard Cizik publicly acknowledged how he felt about creation care and climate change. Remember, he was the vice president of government relations for the National Association of Evangelicals. He lost that position. And it's taken a while, but he has now bounced back and has his own organization called the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good. And he's very much engaged. But yes, it cost him his position.
Let's talk about why.
because his followers weren't there with him. Now, I think thanks to some of the really good work by groups like Restoring Eden and Evangelical Environmental Network and others, we're getting to a point where more and more evangelicals are, especially young evangelicals. The Evangelical Environmental Network has a younger group called Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. I was with them in New York City at the second presidential debate for a prayer rally, and it was amazing. It was really, really great. So young evangelicals are really on board with this, and more other evangelicals are coming on board. And it might not be through climate change. A lot of them are more worried about sex trafficking, but you can tie that to climate change. They're worried about missionary work in developing nations. Developing nations are those who are hit hardest by climate change. So you don't have to mention climate change to talk to them about issues that they care about. I met here with Jim and a number of others right here in this very room. I think you guys had to move your class that afternoon to talk about energy access for people living in poverty. So how do you provide photovoltaic suitcases and lights for people in Africa? There's some interesting organizations named, like Light for the World. So how do you help developing nations to have the same kind of conveniences that we have in terms of light and electricity without adding as much emissions as we have in the process? So starting at the very basis. And there are a lot of faith-based organizations that are very on board with the basic principle of helping them to develop and providing relief and support. Is that?
Hi, I'm Juliana. So you were talking before about going to all the different types of churches, and I think you said 17 different.
I was with that organization for 17 of them. They're still going. That was during 2006 and 2007. I thought for sure maybe they would, like his persona would be great, but it would wear off after a while. But they're still doing them all over the state. It's great.
Yeah, so I'm just out of curiosity, were there any churches that had stronger reactions to it, positively or negatively, or was there anything that stood out? Because I just find that really interesting. Like, was there any kind of denomination that was more for, setting up these creation care teams than others? Just.
Yeah, as you can imagine, it reflected sort of the larger picture in the U.S. The mainline Protestants and the more progressive Catholics were much more open to doing it than others. But we asked some of the harder ones as well. Some of these really large conservative suburban churches in very unexpected conservative demographics. And because it's about creation care and good stewardship, most of them were pretty open to it. At the very least, just providing a venue to have these forums. And we were really, really pleasantly surprised by the turnout. Here's the other thing. One thing that we didn't expect in forming these creation care teams and putting on all these forums, we had, I helped found a group called Congregations Caring for Creation, and now exists in kind of another form. It's part of Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. But we had on sort of like a 5-year or 10-year long-term vision. Part of our plan was to reestablish a new sense of community. Sounds kind of, vague and blissful. But in meeting with members of these creation care teams, and I would go one-on-one to all these congregations, and others would go as well, just sitting down with people, and we'd have, 80-year-old ladies that, really thought their only ability to contribute would be, lick and stamp envelopes. And they were there. They knew they didn't understand all of the science, but they were present at these meetings. New grandmothers were in tears because they just had their first grandchild and were really thinking about the legacy they're leaving. So in sharing why they were there was an incredible bonding experience. And just that meeting, they would look forward to meeting again on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. And we just were so impressed. It's very, very, very genuine, very anti-consumerist, very hopeful, very intergenerational. Just everything we could have hoped for in renewing a sense of community that was very countercultural happened within a year's time span, not 10 years. That sort of answers your question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tenzin. I'm not sure if I'm asking the same thing Jonah asked, but my question is, what do you think why U.S. has not adopted the environmental tax shift policy? And what are some reasons that some of the opponent of the adoption of the policy put forward?
Like the Kyoto Protocol and things like that? Like, why have we not?
Yeah, why U.S. Government has not adopted the green tax policy?
Okay. The green tax policy. I'm not
Like,
sure if I'm familiar.
It seems like right now they give more focus on reinforcing activities that are environmentally friendly, but not really levying high taxes on environmentally harmful activities.
So, like, letting industry get away with pollution and providing a lot of subsidies, money. It comes back to economics and money. When you hear the politicians talking about loopholes, closing corporate loopholes, that's something that definitely needs to be done. But also, I try and not just demonize the industry because I'm a consumer. Now, when I meet with people on Capitol Hill, and when I was working for the Lutheran Church, I could not say that I represented all Lutherans and would never say that. And they would think that would just be hilarious, right? Because some are very conservative and some are very progressive. But I could say that based on our biblical teachings that we are called to address climate change. Where was I going with this? I'll think about where I was going with this. Wow, I totally lost my train of thought. Why have we not addressed? Gosh, does anybody else want to take a stab
because
at
it
that?
looks like it's been pretty beneficial for other countries like Finland and other countries, and I don't know, there's this organization called OECD.
We subsidize fossil fuel industries to the nth degree. Our nation just is so dependent upon fossil fuels. And I don't think that's going to change. This professor from Texas Tech University thinks that fossil fuel industries need to be part of the solution. He doesn't think he thinks natural gas is here to stay. It is cleaner and more efficient than coal. I would argue that even if we don't, in the U.S., burn the coal and our carbon dioxide emissions go down, that we're going to ship it out to some other country that's going to burn it. So overall, global emissions aren't going to change. Now, he also talks about, and this gets back into subsidies and government subsidies and how we are a capitalist society and how we fund and don't fund certain things. He says that in between, and forgive me for kind of stumbling through this because it's not my area of expertise, in small companies trying to start up renewable energy and making it more affordable for consumers, them doing it compared to big companies doing it, there is such a huge risk. If they fail, their companies fail. If a fossil fuel industry does that, like ExxonMobil, for example, and fails, that just is a small dent in their overall profit line. So they call that gap between startup companies and then major established corporations the valley of death or something like that. So he thinks that if you make wind and solar more competitive with non-renewables and you decrease that valley of death, that gap, or you provide subsidies to those smaller companies so that they don't fail if an idea fails, then you have a whole different playing field. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
So, when you were talking about Minnesota, you mentioned like as a state they passed comprehensive, green energy bill, and I know with the election and the way the build up to it, there's a stronger emphasis on like states' rights, and I know in the past individual states have tried to push green reform through. California tends to be the go-to example of implementing higher or stricter regulations and whatnot. What are the benefits of having this, states' rights movement if we're not going to see another comprehensive energy bill in Congress for another 10 years? What's the benefits of having states really pursue it? And then what are the impediments that states are facing that want to pursue cleaner technologies and, I guess, these environmentally friendly energy sources?
Great question. It is really tough when it comes to things like air pollution, because even when when this was up for, for a hearing before it was passed, why should we clean up our act when the air that we breathe is mostly coming from the western part of the U.S.? And that's the same argument that a lot of states, and the question that a lot of states and regional entities ask themselves. Some of them collectively are pretty principled. They say, well, we can't ask other states to clean up their act if we don't clean up ours. Now, a couple years ago, I was, before I moved to D.C., I was here in D.C. for a clean air campaign. And there was a woman from West Virginia at the microphone asking EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson for federal legislation on carbon and other forms of pollution. She said West Virginia itself will never, ever, ever pass that kind of legislation. They need the federal government for protection. It's true. West Virginia's economy is almost entirely based on coal. So, they won't ever see that. So if their people are not to breathe dirty air and see mountaintop mining removal, you have to have federal legislation. There are some examples, and I'm not an expert on this by any sense, but of other types of legislation where when enough states have passed it, it gives coverage for the federal government to go ahead and pass it. Do you know anything about this, Jacob?
No, but that's true in a lot of policies.
Yeah, it doesn't work for in every case, but.
Do you think that's especially true in the case of emissions?
Emissions? Oh gosh.
Because that's all. The federal has done that.
I think we're seeing some of it in standards for fuel efficiency in vehicles and things like that.
Okay.
You guys probably know better than I do what the answer is to some of those questions. Do you have any examples?
I mean, I was just curious, if certain states are going to try to push, installing solar panels or whatnot. I mean, I guess states out in the West Coast. And I know, I don't know, I guess there's been pressure from oil companies, to resist, allowing states to individually, increase emissions or have, I guess, solar panels and whatnot and move towards these alternative energy sources with the, belief that when it becomes, I guess the whole states' rights issue becomes very fluid when if it doesn't benefit these companies, then it should get bumped up to the federal level where the feds really aren't going to push for it anytime soon.
Well, and it's tough too with taxation. Wisconsin's argument for a long time was that Wisconsin is open for business, meaning businesses wouldn't have the same kind of taxes that they have in neighboring states. I think we still have to see whether that actually works or not.
In terms of a response to the church's negative reaction to a lot of these arguments on the environment and on environmental protection and environmentalism in general, how would you suggest that this movement approach more conservative churches? For example, the Southern Baptist Church, certain sects are extremely, extremely conservative in terms of their views on this, or the United Pentecostal Church, different churches that are really opposed to these sorts of issues, especially when it comes to the environment.
Yeah, great question. I have a lot of colleagues. We're working on that collectively. Messaging to specific audiences, including those. One of the things that works is just second commandment, loving your neighbor as yourself. Because no matter what you think about dominion, domination, and what we learn in Genesis, there are different theological interpretations of that. So even for those who believe that what we might call the wise use policy, that God gave us all these wonderful resources to use at our at our disposal, and that really it's about the next life and saving souls. Even that argument that does not, where the rubber meets the road with them is harming other humans. You can't remove an entire mountain top in West Virginia and not have horrible toxic chemicals seeping into these neighboring communities. I mean, the cancer rates, these clusters are just phenomenal. So, human interest. There are theological arguments. We're trying to figure out which ones work best. Climate in and of itself is definitely a non-starter. You might be able to talk about carbon pollution in terms of human health, but climate is seen as a political issue, so we need to make it a theological and in some areas a scientific one. And it is very theological.
And then this will have to be our last question before the break so we can move on with some of the other plans for the day.
Thanks for coming in and talking to us. I'm Ethan. My question is, the climate change movement got started, I guess, with organizations like Greenpeace that were, maybe definitely not theological, and often more on the highly left-wing, highly anti-religion side of the political spectrum. So could you discuss the internal dynamics of the climate change movement right now and how you are situated and what your engagement is like with groups like Greenpeace and Sierra Club, who are maybe not necessarily about religion and more for environment's sake? Are you having more success with their religious message? Are they having more success with their climate-only message? And what's the future of that dialogue, and is there prospects to work together?
Funny, when I was still in Minnesota, but working with and hearing from colleagues who were representing organizations from other states, we'd come to DC once or twice a year for conferences and to have meetings on the Hill. And our secular environmental organization colleagues would say, and this is like mid to late 2000, or like around 2007, 2008, so before the recession hit. The secular environmental organization people would say, we've tried for decades to get people of faith on board with the environment message. You've only been doing this seemingly for the last 5 to 10 years, and you're making huge strides. How'd you do it? And by and large, the faith leaders said, because you finally let us do it ourselves, which I thought was really fascinating. So we had to own it for ourselves. We had to reach pretty deep into our own theology. And you saw some of that in your readings for this week. I mean, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has a statement. The LCA has a social statement on not only caring for creation, sufficient sustainable livelihood, but also an economic one. And there's a theologian, Joseph Sittler, who was talking about this in the early 1900s. For the Catholics, St. Francis of Assisi called all of the plants and animals on earth his brothers and sisters, which is why in that tradition, and still in many of the mainline Protestant traditions, we have a blessing of the animals every fall. So I think part of it is that we've started to own it for ourselves, and now that a lot of the mainline Protestant and some of the Catholic groups are doing that, I think you're seeing some of the more conservative denominations just starting to do some of that as well. I mean, there's just a long line of, these faith traditions do not move quickly. What you said made me think of something else. Other part of your question I didn't yet answer.
Like long-term engagement together.
Long-term engagement together. I was at a meeting a couple months ago with the secular environmental group, and they were talking about, instead of calling this movement about climate change, making it climate justice, so making it a human rights movement and taking it completely out of the environmental sector. I thought that was fascinating because it's essentially what the faith groups have been trying to do for the last several years. And in the 1.5 hours I was listening to people talk, I did not hear a mention of faith groups once. So it felt like that was a little bit of a slap in the face. And there was a fellow from the Catholic Coalition on Climate Change who was also there, and he did a really good job of pointing out, this person was from Europe, this person spearheading this movement. And so very different scene in Europe. But we said, if you're going to address any sort of climate human rights thing in the U.S., you have to include faith groups. That's our history, right? The civil rights movement was based in faith communities. So this Catholic guy did a really good job of, Dan Misla is his name, pointing out that when there was comprehensive legislation on the table in 2010, the folks who made the strongest arguments and were the biggest advocates for mitigation and adaptation funding in this legislation for developing nations were the faith groups. And you'll see that if we see any more legislation. It will include any version of a carbon tax, energy efficiency, anything you see will include from faith groups, protecting the poorest of the poor and providing adaptation and mitigation funds for developing nations, because those who've least contributed to the problem are those who are bearing the biggest brunt. So there's collaboration, but sometimes the movements need to operate in parallel, and they're usually pretty respectful of one another.